event tonight. First of all, I wanted to thank our sponsors for this event, the Maison Française, and especially Shannon here and her fantastic staff, the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, and the European Institute. So I'm going to introduce the participants very briefly because I'm eager to hear from all of them. But our guest speaker tonight is Michel Feher, who is by training a philosopher, the founding editor of Zone Books, also very much a public intellectual whose work has been intimately tied to a form of activism, to kind of ethics. So Michel has written on a great number of themes, but I'm going to mention four kind of general themes that he's been interested in, at least since I've known him. Maybe there's others before. The first one is the question of desire and sexuality. And so in this context, he's written on the history of the body, on libertine literature, on feminism, and debates around same-sex unions in France. The second big kind of preoccupation has been the question of non-governmental politics. And in this context, the possibility of imagining a political activism that would be outside the dichotomy between governing and governed. A third interest, a very kind of recurring interest in his work has been immigration. And in this context, I can mention a collective that he founded in 2007 called Cette France-là, which tried to basically audit the government of Nicolas Sarkozy and publish the results of the immigration data in various anthologies. And finally, neoliberalism, which is what has been preoccupying him for several years. And so today he's going to talk about this, so I'm not going to say very much. But I think one of the things that's very interesting about his book and about his work on neoliberalism is it's not just an attempt to diagnose or to understand neoliberalism, but really Michel is trying to give us tools for thinking a possible resistance outside, again, the terms that we're always given, right? Either you're implicit with neoliberalism or you want to overthrow the whole thing. So trying to think of an alternative. And I could really not have imagined two better people to have a dialogue with Michel tonight, Adam Tooze and Bernard Harcourt. Adam holds the Shelby Colin Davis Chair in the History Department here at Columbia, and he's also the director of the European Institute. He's the author of many books, and I'm just going to name a few: Statistics and the German State, The Wages of Destruction, The Making and Breaking of the Nazi Economy, and the most recent ones, The Deluge, about the Great War, and this summer, Crashed, which just came out, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. And one of the themes that also goes through Adam's work is how basically trying to understand the relationship between the political and the economic, and the role that ideology and expertise have had in shaping economic power. So very much related to the conversation, I think, of today, or the kinds of questions that Michel is raising in his book. And finally, Bernard, who is the Isidore and Selville Stuhlbacher Professor of Law and Political Science, also at Columbia. He's the founding director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, which I think is also a way to try to put activism and scholarship together, and to try to think of how the different texts can help us resist or think about the world in different ways. And also, I think, working very much in the tradition of Michel Foucault, who really looms large in this panel, or not large here. So Bernard is also the author of numerous books, including The Illusion of Free Markets, and Exposed Desire and Disobedience in the Digital Age, and most recently, The Counter-Revolution, How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens. So the way we had thought of doing this is that Michel is going to talk for about 15 minutes and introduce the book, talk about his main ideas, and then we'll open it up to Adam first, and then Bernard, and then to the audience. So please join me in welcoming our panel today.
My turn?
Your turn.
Thank you, Camille, for this overly generous presentation, and thank you to all the hosts of this event. So yes, I'm going to try to summarize the book in 15 minutes. I'm going to try to make it short. But, you know, when you see an old guy with a French accent say that it's going to be short, skepticism is annoying. I'll do my best. So, in the book, I tried to summarize it like that, to make 3 moves, which I will list in case, you know, I never get to the end, at least list. The first one is to try to think through the nexus between neoliberalism and financialization. The second one is, the second move, is that if indeed there is a discrepancy, which is what I argue, between at least the neoliberal agenda and the financialization that ensued from that agenda, then what is one to do in terms of resistance to the condition shaped by finance and by financialized capitalism? So that's the second point. So it's the activist point that Camille alluded to. And then the third question is that I started this book like another book that I read recently by my neighbor on the left before 2016, the fateful year of 2016, and then 2016 happened, this Brexit, this Trump's election, and things changed. And so it's very incipient in the book, but it's something that if I have time I would like to touch on, is how is this financialized condition affected or affecting the post-2016 market. All right, so that's my agenda, whether I'll fulfill it, we'll see. So first, the neoliberalism financialization nexus. Because the critique of the turn in capitalism since the turn of the 80s, that critique is either a critique of neoliberalism or a critique of financialization. By neoliberalism, we mean a certain mode of government, a certain art of governing that imposes itself in the early 80s through the conservative revolution, even though the theory of it was shaped way before that, starting in the 30s, as Winston Williams showed us in a recent book, but certainly in the 40s with the foundation of the model society. So, nonetheless, neoliberalism becomes the dominant part of government in the early 80s, and through the implementation of neoliberal policies, capitalism becomes financialized. However, if you read neoliberal theorists, there's pretty little about finance in what they say. And I would make the claim that financialization was neither announced nor even foreseen by neoliberal theorists, and not necessarily planned by the first implementers of the neoliberal agenda, such as Thatcher and Reagan. And the discrepancy, the difference between the two, between what was planned and what actually was produced, is quite important. It's important heuristically, but I want to make the claim that it's also important politically. So what is that difference? So very schematically, the conservative revolution at the turn of the 80s was about making the free world vibrant again by imposing market discipline on everything, from states to companies to individuals. Thatcher and Reagan, the main spearhead of that conservative revolution, faulted their predecessors for responding to the restive 60s with bad moves, such as inordinate minimum wage and social benefit raises, which caused inflation to soar. But the neoliberals also blamed the CEOs of large corporations for acting as brokers between the wishes of shareholders and other stakeholders of companies, thereby causing profits to wane. And finally, they lamented that the propensity of politicians and of employers to placate the special interest groups, especially wage earners, enticed people, wage earners in particular, to rely more on wealth redistribution by the state and on collective bargaining by unions than on their own hard work and initiative. So therefore, the point for the neoliberal was to harness the power of the state in order to help markets do their job. And for them, this was not only good for business. More importantly, the ultimate purpose of their policies was to encourage the entire population, and especially people who were not entrepreneurs by trade, to think and behave like self-reliant entrepreneurs. In their view, awakening the entrepreneurial spirit of every citizen required the creation of a new environment, which the state was supposed to provide. An environment where private companies, public administrations, and individual consumers in need of resources would have to compete for private funding. That's how the market discipline would work. That's how you would get out of this tendency, which for the neoliberals was leading liberal democracy towards socialism. So, to that end, in order to create this market discipline for everyone, the neoliberal proceeded to lift the constraints that had hitherto limited the transnational circulation of capital, that had kept the various branches of the financial industry separate, and that had checked the creativity of financial engineering. All these limits and regulation had to be lifted to make sure that people would have access to private funding and would compete for private funding, thereby shaping their entrepreneurial ethos. So these deregulations certainly enabled financial institutions to act as the arbiters of valuable endeavors. However, I would argue that the order of priorities that resulted from the ascendancy of investors, right, who are now free and empowered to decide what endeavor was worthy and what wasn't. So the ascendancy of finance and of investors turned out to be quite different in terms of its order of priority than what its political facilitators had envisioned. Because financial markets, as John Maynard Keynes already warned many years ago, do not operate like other markets. They certainly coordinate transactions like other markets, but their specific function is not to coordinate transaction, but to pool predictions. Which means that the signals that financial markets produce are not exactly prices representing the outcome of negotiations between buyers and sellers, but instead of prices, they are ratings expressing the speculation of investors on the value of the projects submitted to them. So that's a fundamental difference between financial markets and other markets, which Keynes and some of his disciples like Minsky insisted upon, but was never considered or picked up by orthodox economists and even less neoliberals. And on top of that, Keynes added, and that's crucial for what ensued, I believe, that what investors actually speculate upon when they assess projects is not the eventual yield of an initiative, but its immediate impact on the attention of other investors. In other words, what investors assess is the next assessment of their colleagues, not the ultimate outcome of what is being assessed. So when economic agents were submitted to that kind of guessing game, they transformed quite radically. Corporations were the first type of economic agents to internalize that guessing game of the potential backers of companies. And indeed, for almost now 4 decades, the CEOs of corporations have been less intent on maximizing commercial profits, conceived as the difference between sales revenues and production costs, than on bolstering their company's financial credit, which is measured by the market value of the stock, the stock. So that means that for a company, unrealized capital gain, in other words, what you would get for your stock if you were to sell it, is more important than operating cash flow, in other words, the money that you make by selling the company. And unrealized capital gain becomes the metrics of success. Something that explains, for instance, that firms, corporations use a large portion of their resources to buy back their own stocks on the secondary market. This is a strategy that makes no sense commercially, but makes perfect sense when the only thing that you want is to raise the value of your stock. But the primacy of ratings of that sort was not confined to the private sector. Keen on improving the attractiveness of the companies of their country based on their territories, governments from the 80s on have catered to investor preferences for business-friendly tax codes, for instance, and flexible labor markets. And of course, the result of that, the result of the efforts they made to attract investors on their territory, meant that they lost a large amount of fiscal revenue, right? Because these business-friendly tax codes don't get so much fiscal revenues, which meant that they had to borrow the money that they could no longer collect through taxes, which meant that governments too became dependent on this time not the stock market but the bond market, which meant that keeping the trust of bondholders took precedence over the obsession with growth that post-war had. So there again, you have a shift from profit to credit. And in time, the sway of shareholders and bondholders' valuation has extended to household and individuals as well, if only indirectly. Because when employers and political leaders who vie for investors' attention, they can no longer provide some things like lifelong careers and a sturdy safety net, which means that it's now up to job applicants themselves to make themselves valuable, either by advertising highly prized skills or an appealing social network, or failing that, when they don't have that, what they have to try to do is to make their unlimited availability and flexibility into valuable assets. Moreover, because of the precarious labor condition, more and more people have to borrow to access housing, but also to study, but also to survive sometimes. But in order to borrow, when you don't have vast collateral, you need nonetheless to give some guarantees. So when you don't have anything else, the guarantee will be based on the future price, the expected price of the house that you want to buy, the expected yield of the degree that you want to get, and so forth. But also the fact that you've been a good borrower before paying back your loans, and so your credit score and your reputation for creditworthiness and for trustworthiness is important. Which means that for people as much as for companies and states, credit trumps revenues, credit trumps profits, credit trumps income altogether. The point is asset appreciation rather than maximization of income. So that means that altogether the type of conduct and the type of expectation fashioned by the speculation of investors do not really fit the entrepreneurial type that the conservative revolution and that the neoliberals were supposed to mold. Because pro-market reforms by the neoliberals purported to create a world where capital owners, wage earners, and even the unemployed would envision their lives as a profit-seeking business. They would calculate every decision in terms of cost and eventual benefit. But in contrast, what financialized capitalism has molded, what it has bred, are not profit-seeking entrepreneurs, but credit-seeking portfolio managers, who are primarily attentive to the appraisals of the assets composing both their material and their human capital. And you could even say that in the last 15 years, this dominion, this empire of creditworthiness, has gone beyond the purely economic world and has blurred the realms of economic and non-economic relations. Social media, for instance, that operate with the same techniques as financial market, have built a culture that is based on the relentless pursuit of credit. Likes, friends, reviews online are what you are supposed to get in order to bolster your credit. And the proliferation of platforms where you are invited to share, as they say, your experience, but also your competence, but also your needs, but also your opinions, do not mold the ideal type of the neoliberal entrepreneur who would sort of, build himself, mostly himself, by pulling on his bootstraps, but a pursuit of credit, which is by definition always social credit, always given by others. And so what you spend your time doing is to try to spark bullish speculation on what you own, on how you are, and who your friends are. So there again, even beyond the strictly economic world, being deemed creditworthy is what enables people to navigate the world. So that is my first part, and I'm going to end. I have 5 more minutes again. Second one. So the question then is, how is that world to be not only inhabited, because we inhabit it whether we like it or not, but how is it to be addressed by those who don't like it? And it seems to me that the financialized world that has been produced in the past 30 years changes quite drastically what could be called the geography of social conflict, the geography of social struggle. And classically, under industrial capitalism, the two main realms of social struggles were, on the one hand, the labor market, where, that is to say, the market where labor is turned into a commodity and priced as such. And that's where unions and employees and employers would negotiate to try to get the best price possible for wage earners in particular. So the labor market was one of the main sides of social struggle, and the electoral scene was another one where different parties representing the interests of different social categories were vying for political power. Of course, these two realms have not disappeared, but my claim is that they're increasingly preempted, in a way, by two new sides of social struggle, which are the stock market and the bond market, financial markets altogether. In other words, the focus, the center of gravity of social struggle seems to be moving from the market where labor is turning to a commodity and priced as such, towards the market where endeavors of all sorts are turning to securities and rated as such. So that creates a new field of social tension. For instance, what that means is that corporate managers basically want to please the shareholder by creating value for the shareholder, which means that their opponent then, or the opponent, the adversary of the structural adversary of the shareholder is no longer just the employee, but the other stakeholders altogether. Because creating shareholder value is done necessarily at the expense of the other stakeholders, yes, the workers, but also the consumers, but also the suppliers, but also the taxpayers of the site where the company is built and so forth. So therefore, in terms of social struggle, what is at stake, it seems to me, is to create some kind of a stakeholder consciousness, just like there was working class consciousness before. And around what will that stakeholder consciousness can be built? Well, what's interesting is that in each case, there is this ambivalent institution that is both the instrument of capitalist predation and the object of resistance. In the olden days of industrial capitalism, this institution was wages. Labor unions, the labor movement, on the one hand, criticized wage as the very instrument of exploitation, not only because the wages were low, but wage labor itself, as Marx explained, is the very subject formation of capitalist exploitation. But at the same time, while criticizing the very notion of the worker, supposedly the owner of his or her labor force, that they try to sell at the best possible price, which is a liberal contraption on which exploitation is predicated. Instead of just criticizing it, which they did, they also appropriated it and embraced it, because what are unions if not associations of free workers who band together, like cartels band together, as owners of the same commodity, wage labor, their labor power, in order to try, by acting in solidarity, to raise the price of labor power in the labor market. So the question is to find the equivalent of wages in financialized capitalism. And it seems to me that that equivalent is what is called corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is, on the one hand, the crumbs that is left to the stakeholder once shareholder value is being created. But at the same time, corporate literature is all about saying that we are all in good corporations interested in boosting our social responsibility, because social responsibility is an asset. So, markets like companies that are socially responsible because it gives a good name to the company and it's good for the stock ultimately. So you have a win-win situation. Of course, it's questionable that this is true, just as it was questionable that wages were supposed to really pay their due to the workers. However, it seems to me that appropriating social corporate responsibility in the same way that unions appropriated wages is the new form of resistance at the level of the company. And in terms of the state, what you have is that you have now governments who are caught between the wishes of the bondholders, who, in order for the bond of the country to go up, need to have flexible labor market, business-friendly tax codes, strong intellectual property rights, and so forth, and the needs of their constituents, who are, by and large, in the majority, harmed by these wishes of the bondholder. So there again, a new tension appears, this time in the bond market, between the bondholders on the one hand and the bonded citizen on the others, in other words, the indebted citizen on the other. And there, the question is, what would be the substance that could be appropriated and worked with? Well, it's the fact that governments who make their priority to answer to the wishes of bondholders, nonetheless cannot let their constituents down completely. So what they've been promising for the past 20 years is that, of course, we cannot offer lifelong careers anymore, and we cannot really offer a sturdy safety net, social safety net anymore. But what we can do is to help people become more appreciable. In other words, we can help them attract sponsors, we can help them attract recruiters, we can help them reassure lenders, we can help them get followers. So it's this notion of boosting the value of the human capital of their constituent, which seems to be since the 90s the main promise of government. So there again, that should be criticized, but it also should be appropriate in the sense that what indeed will boost our human capital, in other words, what makes us creditworthy or not, becomes very much a state of social structure. And so I will leave my third point in the discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bernard. First of all, I would like to thank Shani for hosting us this event, Camille for inviting me to do this, and Michel for this fascinating book. It's a pleasure to be here. I really did enjoy it. This move that you make of running the narrative of financialization against the narrative of neoliberalism is great. It's a great move. Separating the two, even just separating them, is a great first move. And I really appreciate the way in which what you then proceed to do is to look for the spaces, the levers, the zones in which agency might be developed. And I also, as you won't be surprised to hear, particularly appreciate the way in which in that search for agency, you very deliberately resist a kind of nostalgic reassertion of mid-20th century model of social democracy. And instead, as it were, insist that we should proceed analogically. Essentially, we need to look in the present, which is different, for things which are analogous functionally to that lever which wage labour once provided, which I think is an opening to the future, which is very generative and everything promising. And I can't help noting that we fundamentally agree on the need to guard against the tempting, I think, move towards a kind of national vision of social democracy and its reassertion, particularly in the confrontation between citizens, taxpayers, and bond markets imagined as a kind of cosmopolitan, ruthless force, irresponsible and driven by, well, nothing but a profit motive. No doubt, of course, that it is driven by the profit motive. But it's the assignment of the national and the cosmopolitan, which I think is a profound dead end. So on all of this, I think we have absolutely profound agreement. And so let me attempt to sort of move the argument in a couple of ways. And I think basically this revolves around my unease with financialization. I love the way in which you destabilize neoliberalism by running financialization against it. What I worry about a little bit is the reified conception of financialization that does the work as the wedge in your argument. One element of that worry is the kind of the worry of a historian, in the sense that we end up, and I'm making this argument not as a criticism because the joy of the book, its elegance, derives in a sense from the simplicity of the argument, of the elements that you manipulate, and maybe that's a philosopher's book in that sense. So, as a historian though, one of the things I worry about is the way in which you end up essentially with a sort of stage theory of capitalism. As you said, there's the olden days where we did wage labour and wage labour politics, and now we're in financialization. And I would be tempted to say that following exactly the line that you're talking about, in which temporality, historicity is in fact crucial to your entire argument, that we might explore a more complex notion of historical development that would open the possibility of, in a sense, both operating side by side, to be banal. And then we might think about what other temporalities, what other dynamics of capitalist development might be at work. Because I'm profoundly unconvinced that financialization, conceived of as a sort of synecdoche for the entire system, is at all helpful in thinking about our circumstances. It's money, so inevitably it is a mode of generalization. That's no surprise. But it seems to me to sit alongside a variety of others, one of which continues to be labour, and the calories and the energy and the capital that goes into the formation, the production and reproduction of labour. That's still operative in our world. The great colour brings that home very nicely. But there are others. Information, many people would insist, will be another common denominator. Energy, fossil fuels, one might think of. Anyway, that's, I think, one zone where I would be interested in what for you is at stake in that periodization, or is it just a heuristic, kind of a philosopher's move, this, that, and then we can move. So, thinking about financialization itself, I wanted to make 3 suggestions, all of which move exactly in the grain of your argument, but I think could expand it even more. And they really pertain to this distinction that you make between the logic of the stock market, which you think of as a sort of Keynesian beauty contest, investors trying to guess other people's, apparently in the interwar period these were common, these beauty contests, in which the aim of the game was to guess what everyone else thought was the most beautiful, whatever it was, cauliflower or something. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the bond market. And then you assign those, so you assign the stock market to corporations, and you assign the bond market to governments. And then you derive the logics of power that operate in those two. So I wanted to ask 3 or make 3 points about those markets and the logics of power that operate there. First of all, I wonder what you think about an encounter I had last week with a senior finance guy from eBay, and sort of people I meet nowadays. Anyway, so senior finance guy from eBay sitting at lunch, and what's he moaning on about? He's moaning on about Amazon, and he's moaning about Amazon because Amazon is a freakish entity to compete with, because it takes the logic that you describe to extraordinary extent. I mean, the company is one of the highest valued in the world. It has never made a beam of profit on the thing it's famous for, not a cent, effectively. And this is astonishingly difficult to compete with. So it messes with the valuations of everyone else that has to compete with it. And eBay, not surprisingly, is obsessed with what on earth is going on in this freakish market. And there are 2 options, and these are the words he used. One is fanaticism. So eBay apparently is convinced that there is a fanatical group of investors who will simply, so in this beauty contest, there is a weird sort of internal psychological logic with some of them are fanatical. So they're not in fact engaged in the game of betting what everyone else is going to think. They just are engaged in more and more valuing this thing which they love. Apple has a similar kind of bunch of followers who just, and not surprisingly, they're beautiful objects, but anyway, so that disturbs the logic quite profoundly, right? And I wonder whether that doesn't offer opportunities for agency too, because it kind of a de-radicalization, if you like, of the stock market might be what's called for. We need to remove the tech jihadis from the game. His other suggestion was no less disturbing, which is that basically everyone buying Amazon is betting on them achieving total monopoly. So right now they make no profit, but in due course they will rule the world, and then they will make endless amounts of profit. And that, of course, is also an expectation that is capable of destabilization. So to me, as where we flesh out the beauty contest, it seems that your argument becomes more and more powerful. In other words, what is the counter-speculative kind of politics you can mobilize when it isn't simply a matter of everyone trying to guess everyone else in that kind of mundane. That's a kind of very mid-century mass man kind of conception. We might not be in that world anymore. Another slightly more technical point, which totally obsesses economic analysis at this very moment, is that the assignment between the stock market and the bond market that you make doesn't quite describe the modern world. Because those share repurchases that you pick up on, which are such a significant instance, are in many cases funded not out of profits, because remember they don't make any profits, this, but out of debt. So the companies themselves are now simultaneously balancing the whole social responsibility business, which is substituting for what used to be for-list management, the share side of things with the fanaticals or the that weird, disturbed beauty contest, and massive leverage. And in the current moment, with interest rates going up, that is the crunch point in global capitalism at the current moment, is high-yielding corporate bonds, which don't figure in your story at all. But I wonder what kind of leverage one might think about then. Because, and I haven't really been able to quite puzzle this out yet, and the entire world of economic analysis is trying to figure out what it means, and I don't think we do understand. But it certainly means that in your assignment, the corporation in fact straddles the two markets. It's not just in the share market, it's in the bond market too. And it would be very interesting to think about because in the bond market, the form of agency, and this brings me to my final point, that you suggest is the Estrach model, right? Isn't that how you pronounce it? The Spanish model of getting in the face of politicians. And the bond market gets in the face of governing classes, is the argument. It's there because you make this very interesting argument about the way in which the real issue between democratic politics and the bond market is temporalities, is time. The bond market is there every single minute of every single day, and voters are there only because otherwise, and this is typical of your argument, it's difficult to understand why politicians would sell out as badly as they do, because they're not stupid, they want to get re-elected. Donald Trump is openly scornful of anyone who spends too much time worrying about the bond market. So, anyway, what will be the equivalent of the speeding up of supervision that you identify in democracy as an issue? How does that work out in the corporate realm? How do these different levels of monitoring operate? Are they just getting streamed out from two different sides at once? What possibilities does that offer for counter-speculation? Then the third point, and that's where I'll wrap things up. Your characterization of the bond market, I really like on the one hand, because you don't succumb to the fatalism of bond market dominance that has been to my mind, such a baneful legacy of the Eurozone crisis. The left in Europe has learned to think about debt through the example of Greece. And it is an absolutely terrible example to think about the history and the politics of debt in general through, because it is such a peculiar historical conjuncture. It is a corner solution, deliberately constructed as such by a group of extremely self-conscious conservative orgs in Europe, operating through the institutions of the Eurozone. It is no place for anyone interested in progressive politics to think the politics of debt through, because it basically, it reifies, it absolutizes impotence, and that is what it describes. And your book refuses that and says, no, we need to think about our agency in this case. What I would urge is that you go much, much further than you do, because and in a sense, it's to bring Keynesianism, it's to bring the circular flow of Keynesianism back into the story. Because the way in which the Eurozone teaches, the Greek instance of the Eurozone has taught us to think about the bond market is as this oppressive global monster that dominates political decision by way of the spread. And this is the nightmare of the Italians at the current moment too. The spread is a thing. And that is your deviation from Germany. But of course, what that model never really factors into the equation is Germany, whose interest rate is plunging. If you take a weighted index of global bond markets, the situation is not that of soaring spreads, but of collapsing yields across the entire world. It has never been easier for the group of the most powerful and rich states, which also tend to be the largest ones, to borrow money on any terms they like. People will in fact pay German taxpayers for them to borrow. Now, why is that? And that is because the point that you make about financial systems, that we are almost all simultaneously on both sides of almost all financial deals, we are simultaneously rating other people's projects and selling our own, is true macroscopically to an extent that would only massively empower your book. Because literally trillions of dollars every year have to be invested in some kind of asset globally. In the last 18 months alone, $1.5 trillion have gone into American exchange-traded funds. Now, that's simply because if you save in the macroeconomy, it's got to be invested somewhere. Of course, it won't go to Greece any more than it'll go to Zimbabwe, right? But it will go into the United States. The United States right now has no effective limit on its borrowing capacity. And anyone who tells you that bond vigilantes are going to come and destabilize Trump is barking up the wrong tree. It's not a reality. The Fed is deliberately engineering the squeeze. It's not there in the market. So to my mind, the force of your argument will be enormously increased if, and it's, I think, maybe an effect of the way it's set up, which is that it's based around agencies, so it's based around the corporation, the state, and the individual subject. And what, in a sense, that assumes as the background, but would be even more powerful if that background was fleshed out, are the systemic interconnections that flows of funds around that system, which in a sense generate, behind your politics, a huge wall of money that needs to be directed one way or another. That's all our pensions, that's everyone in this room's 401k, that's everyone's retirement idea, all our life insurance. Everything is flowing into that huge flood. And from the point of view of BlackRock, that is on the one hand hugely empowering because they've got $6.7 trillion to deploy. On the other hand, they do have to deploy $6.7 trillion. And they have to find somewhere that's simultaneously safe and profitable to put it. And that's a huge pressure on those actors. So this double-sided pressure, which you described so beautifully, could be raised to an even higher level. And that, I think, is where progressive politics has to be thinking about that force, which is, in a sense, on our side, or potentially at least mobilizable on our side.
Okay, so as I had expected, I think this will work well. Because although I'll start where the conversation was, I think I'll move us to the issues of praxis and spend a little bit more time there. So I too had some questions as to whether or not we were dealing with periodization of capitalism or shifting epistemologies. And so the way I read the book, in part in response to the early part of your comments, was that, Michel, you do think that there is an ontological shift in capitalism from an industrialized period to a financialized period. And that shift, that ontological shift, and we're in a different advanced capitalist period that is marked by financialization, is accompanied by the epistemological shift of the way in which we think about human capital. So that human capital remains the constant here, and so mode of governing through human capital remains constant. And in that sense, that's where I suppose Foucault's shadow looms in part. But that the way in which we understand the epistemological dimension of human capital changes from one of what you refer to as yield, conceptions of yield versus conceptions of valorization. And that, of course, is the arc, I think, of the story, which is this transformation very elegantly put from the way in which we thought of ourselves, of corporations, of nations, of individuals, as following a particular logic of trying to gain yield, make a profit, versus the way we think about them now in terms of shareholders, managers, stakeholders, and valorization of each other. Now, and on that, I think I'm intrigued. I'm open. I would have some questions as to, maybe, and this follows up on Adam, some questions as to, so where's the weight there as between the ontological periodization versus the way in which we are governing ourselves? In other words, is it more that there are actually structural transformations, or is it more that we are simply emphasizing a different a metric of truth, right? In other words, in other words, financialization was there before as well. and to a certain extent, some form of manufacturing and yield production remains there today. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here at these tables, sitting on these desks, right? So both were there. And so is the transformation really predominantly at the epistemological level of what is the metric of truth in the way in which we think about the market as producing truth? Okay, but all of that is intriguing, and I'm on board to think about it, and I really appreciate reading the text. What concerned me more was when you turned to praxis here. And it seemed to me as if the dominant way in which you were thinking about how to respond was by embracing this investee activism. And so you speak a lot about, on page 57, beating the financial logic by inhabiting the condition better. Right? Counter speculation, shareholder consciousness, where you write on page 226 that creditworthiness is worth buying for. And so most of the directions in which you push us then are to ourselves become more sophisticated investors in ourselves, to embrace this logic and to do it better. And that raises for me 3 questions. First, if there is in fact ontological change in capitalism and periodization, right, then why would we necessarily think that the solution would be to embrace in a reactive way a particular stage of capitalism instead of anticipating whatever is about to come down the pike? So I assume it has to be the case that we're not going to always inhabit this space, that the crash and other forms of capitalist transformation are going to put us somewhere else in the future. Wouldn't it be, so the first question would be, wouldn't it be a little bit reactionary and somewhat limited to think that what we should do is now inhabit this particular space rather than anticipate and somehow push the system in a different direction, if that's possible, or at least to just anticipate where it's going, rather than kind of go backwards. In the same way in which you reject the nostalgia, as Adam was suggesting, of 20th century working class consciousness or other forms of past modes of labor resistance. Would we be wrong to try to inhabit this present, which may already be past, instead of figuring out where we're going? So that would be one question. Then, even if there is no change on the horizon, so if we conclude, for instance, that no, we're going to inhabit this space for a long time, I'm not sure why to embrace the logic rather than to struggle politically against. And let me give you some examples. But why would we want to inhabit this space? And then the third is it always, and the third question is it always necessary to place all kind of economic forms of economic resistance under the rubric of investee activism? So think, for instance, of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. I assume that, think of other boycotts that preceded the period of financialization, right? There were always efforts to hit the opposition where it mattered, in the wallet, in the pocket. But those weren't logics of inhabiting this space of the stakeholder, so much as there were just other forms. In other words, there's been a history, I take it, of economic forms of resistance. Do we necessarily need to place those within the rubric of this epistemology of financialization? My fear in asking these questions is that this investee logic, this notion of inhabiting and counter-speculating and embracing the stakeholder, just doesn't satisfy at least my libido. Well, I mean, protest, resistance, revolution, etc. Right? As Deleuze and Guattari said, you don't do it out of duty, right? You do it out of desire. And it just strikes me that a lot of the forms of protest and resistance are simply not going to be motivated by let me be a better investor in myself or let me figure out the kind of investment strategy here. Okay, so 3 examples. The first, Bernie Sanders. So I've been reading Bernie Sanders because we got Praxis 13 tomorrow. I don't know if you're around, I don't know if you're all around, but we're reading Bernie Sanders tomorrow. I invite you to join us. Adam's going to have something smart to say. He understands the weaknesses of the financial investment model very clearly. And when you read his book, A Guide to Political Revolution, which is an amazing read, I recommend it to you all. It's clear that he sees the problems of financialization. He addresses them pretty clearly. He's got this passage about Walmart where he talks about the fact that Walmart is basically subsidized by American taxpayers, which it is because they're not paying a living wage. So people are getting food, their workers are getting food stamps, their workers are getting housing because they're not paying. So we are, and the solutions are increasing taxes, creating a living wage, etc. All government policies that are, that don't follow this logic of inhabiting the investee space, but have a way of, at least in 2016, I think, having had an enormous influence on particularly younger generations. And maybe again in the future we'll have these. And in part why it's because there are certain ways in which it activates the sense of injustice and protest. I think is not an embrace of the financialization of human capital model of itself. It's something very different. So that would be one example. The second, Standing Rock. You mentioned Standing Rock, and very interesting, page 74, 75, where you talk about the fact that after the no DAPL protests were crushed and eliminated, that the movement has continued through forms of divesting from Bank of America and Wells Fargo, and they've had some success there. There again, it strikes me that first we just filed a lawsuit on Friday, the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought and Standing Rock, about what they did to shut down the road. So we'll see what happens there. But it strikes me that the protests, the galvanization of notions of sovereignty there, and the encampment did a lot more work. And in terms of mobilization of individuals, was not based on an investee human capital model, but on notions of sovereignty, sacred land, and that we wouldn't be where we are if it had been. We wouldn't be where we are if it had been. Well, we're not in a great spot in any of these occupations, which have all been forcibly shut down as a result of police excessive force, etc. So, but I don't think Standing Rock would have galvanized the imagination in the way that it did, and produced other pipeline protests that are ongoing today, had it not been for a sense of land, of space, of of sovereignty, of relationship to nature, etc. If it had simply been a, let's boycott Bank of America. And then third, this on the question of the likes and the shares, and so the digital presentation of self and exposure of self, etc. I think you're certainly right that there is entrepreneurialism there, but I'm not sure, again, that it is anything about creditworthiness. So you mentioned that the likes or the share are kind of like producing a notion of creditworthiness. And again, I sense that desire works differently in this context and functions in a way that is not related to inhabiting a space of the self as an investee entrepreneur, but about presentations of self and wanting to be seen or expose oneself in particular ways. That is again a different pleasure principle. So in the end, I'm concerned that I'm not sure about stakeholder consciousness. I'm not sure. I don't think going back to working class consciousness is going to be the solution. Surely. But it's something else, some other form of consciousness. I've left it blank, so I don't have the right term, but it's libidinal somehow. It is. And forms of solidarity, forms of protest are going to work along different dimensions, it seems to me, than financialization. All right. So
you said we'll give you 2 minutes to respond, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Yes. Don't know where to begin.
You also don't have to respond to everything. You can take
No,
of course.
Just
come along.
Get another 15 minutes. First of all, thank you. It's not so often that a philosopher is characterized as a person who simplifies. So.
But elegant.
No. I'll take it. It seems to me that to go back to the epistemological, ontological, I would say anthropological, what I'm interested in is what my gamble is, to use my lingo, is that there is a shifting condition. A condition, by condition I mean a certain representation of the human condition, a certain way of inhabiting condition, which means a certain way of constructing one's expectation, of molding one's actions, and so on. And that is, I think, something that maybe is occurring not as the direct product or the intentionality of financialization, but I would say through it. This is why the notion of creditworthiness is interesting for me, and precisely because it blurs the boundaries of the economic and the non-economic. So that is the shift that I think is kind of important. And in fact, one of the great moments where you see that anthropological shift is something that you engineered, which was this little event that you had with Gary Becker and Ivan and all that at the University of Chicago. And it's, for me, there's one moment in that thing that can be both seen on YouTube and sort of read, is this moment because Gary Becker is ultimate neoliberal economist and the ultimate theoretician of human capital. And during his entire life, it seems to me, and his work, the vision that Gary Becker has of human capital is very much an industrial capitalist vision of human capital. In other words, human capital is kind of a factory. So you invest in yourself in order to produce income out of yourself, right? He takes it from Irving Fisher, and he develops that, and so that's his vision of it. So he focuses on income. But then things change, and things change due to the victory of him and his friends. And you have things, and that's the beauty of this discussion, when student debt is discussed. Right? Because with student debt, and the way you create student debt, and of course he favors a fully commercialized student debt, is about you get your debt based on the assessment of what the degree that you'll eventually get will yield. But of course, you don't wait for the yield, and the appreciation happens now in a typical financial market way. And the way Gary Becker always prefaced his work on human capital is always the same. You can see the old preface introduction of the various editions. He says that, when I started working on human capital, people had all kind of terrible suspicion. They thought, that I was basically promoting slavery, that, I was promoting the notion that people should be treated as capital, that people should be dehumanized. Of course, so far from me to have that idea. Of course, now people understand that human capital has nothing to do with that. And one of the main way that I can prove you that, of course, I understand what the difference between human capital and other types of capital is that, and he repeats that example over and over again, is the fact that you could never use your human capital as collateral, for instance. Right? Typically, you can't do that, because that would be, of course, that would be considered collateral. And there he is discussing student debt. And of course, what looms is precisely that. And then, especially when you see it on tape, it's amazing because he starts to mumble. And says, well, of course, if it was fully commercialized, then you could kind of use it as collateral. That would be like slavery, and that's a really bad thing, but it's really too bad. And the mumbling, I think, very few moments are more illustrative, I would say, of this sort of anthropological shift than that reassessment of human capital that you can see that, in fact, you go from yielding income to asset appreciation. And indeed, it is in a way accidental. It's not financialization as like this big miraculous or demonic thing that happened, but through all kinds of ways that you can see in the evolution of corporate governance, that you can see in the evolution of monetary policy and all that, what we've had for the past 30 years is a growth that is based on asset appreciation. If there is a growth of the sort, it is propelled by asset appreciation. And that is my bet, at least, has fundamental implications. Beyond, it has implication in the sense that assets and when creditworthiness becomes the state, you don't have an invasion of the economic over the social, on the social, but you have a breakdown of the boundaries that would separate classically what is economic and what is not economic. After all, and that was my third point, and I'll finish there, so is that xenophobic populism is most often represented as a reaction against financialized capitalism. That the crisis, especially the crisis was dealt with by government, created a rage, and that rage, unfortunately, is expressed through nationalist xenophobia. But everybody, there's a large consensus that it was a reaction against the fact that the Fed, in particular, saved banks, but didn't save the people who suffered from the banks, right? And so it's that rage that is now expressed in populism. My claim would be that xenophobic populism is not a reaction to financialization or to the logic of creditworthiness through financialization, but an extension of it. In the sense that what is the big success of Donald Trump is the fact that he has managed to convince or to actually perform the fact that being a flag-waving, gun-carrying white man is an asset. And it's about bolstering the asset value, and nobody says it better than Steve Bannon himself. When he came to the former Front National, now becoming Rassemblement National, to give his first big speech in Europe, his speech, the high moment of his speech, in fact, the real high moment of his speech, which is not the one that was most publicized, was when he said, well, when I was in business school in the 80s, that's when the notion of shareholder value was discovered and pushed. And then he starts this anti-neoliberal critique of how shareholder value has destroyed the whole economy and how terrible it is. But fortunately, now we have Donald Trump, who is not trying to boost shareholder value, but citizenship value. So he, of course, opposes the two, but the techniques and the notion of asset appreciation is exactly the same in both cases. And then libido or not libido, I would say that fortunately, nationalist xenophobes are not the only one playing that game. Because it seems to me that the response to that bolstering of citizenship value are movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, March for Our Lives, all movements which are about, at least that's how I see them, creating their own rating system. Not only to depreciate the very asset that the Bannons of the world want to appreciate, but to reappraise the lives that are damaged by these things. So it seems to me there is a social struggle there, and creditworthiness is at a proximity. And I don't know, but it seems to me that it's the condition in which we are. And one of the main reasons why it's the condition in which we are and why this is important has to do, and Adam was saying, it has to do with time. It has to do with time. It has to do with the fact that, an occupation like Occupy movement or like occupying the Dakota Access Pipeline is an amazing libidinal and political event, just like a demonstration is, just like an election is, but it's a discrete moment. Then you go home, or you're tired out, or you're chased by the police, and it ends. Whereas investors continue to instill their pressure second by second, every second. So it seems to me that the state, the main state, you may like or not like the example that I give, but the main state that we must reckon is to invent a form of activism that is continuous. In other words, however beautiful they are, the discrete events are going to be glorification of the defeat to come. And it's only if you manage to develop a type of activism that manages to be as continuous as that of the adversary that something can happen. And that I think that is very much based on the activism. And if I could, one last word about what you were saying, going back to your debate. Maybe some people believe that one day, some of the shareholders Amazon believe that one day they will dominate the world and they will be income. Maybe. But I'm not even sure. Because it seems to me that the main thing is asset appreciation. Is the fact that the stock goes up, whether it yields or not. And when the stock goes up, what can you do? Exactly what you said, you can borrow. Because you're worth so much that your leverage power is gigantic. There was a very cute little article by James Galbraith about Jeff Bezos a few weeks ago in The Guardian, when it was just published, The Worth of Jeff Bezos, not Amazon, but Jeff himself. And Galbraith was saying, well, it's true, I mean, it's $1 billion, I don't know how many it's worth. But that's his worth. That's not exactly how much money he makes or how much money he can spend. Because the huge amount of his worth is in Amazon stock. And if he starts selling his Amazon stock in order to spend, then his worth is going to really plummet. So what you're worth and how much you make is not the same thing. And it seems to me that there again, the ambivalence of credit and creditworthiness is something interesting to not only to assess and not only to reckon with, but also to embrace and appropriate politically. And that's why I'm saying at the end that there's nothing intrinsically evil about a system of credit. The question is who gets credit and for what. And so that seems to be, yes, a fight worth fighting for.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Bruno?
I have a question about
There's a
the,
mic.
I have a question about the, I was very interested in your third point, because when Bernard was talking, I thought that maybe the philosophical simplification involved a little bit reducing all options to this negotiation, the use of the leverage in sort of corporate social responsibility, in which we are as investors also capable of pushing back and using the system for other purposes. And I started thinking that it didn't take into account other factors, whether they were libidinal or in the olden days they would have been called ideological, actual credit, creditors, belief system. So we can make this economical, but we can also, more in broader terms, talk about this as libidinal or ideological. In other words, when then you talked about xenophobia being sort of not a response or reaction to the financialization and its crisis or the rage that came out as a response, but an extension of it. But then you collapse it back into, this is just Trump using that same mechanism of credit, of credit agency, and upping his value, which he made explicit, the value of my corporation depends on how I feel. So feelings, subjective, libidinal investments, belief system, but also ideology, I don't think that they can simply be modeled along the same sort of streamlined credit rating as a model, analogically to talk about social agency. And so I wonder whether they're not different chessboards, and that the genius or the outrageous sort of coincidence, Trump or Brazil or Poland and other places, is that xenophobia, racism, a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily fit in the nostalgic mode of social responsibility or the search for social justice, which we kind of, when we talk about corporate social responsibility, we think corporations will be responsible in terms of the treatment of nature or the needy or refugees. But what we see now is that ideologically, these credit agencies can also build on most outrageous racist or misogynist or sort of reactionary modes of what we at one point would have called ideology. And so is this all collapsed into the model of an economic analogy on credit agencies, or are there different spaces for activism that would not all have to follow or inhabit that same space?
Do you want to take maybe two or three questions, Kendall?
I'm wondering, Michel, about this question of what you describe in the book as the collapse of the distinction between the economic and the non-economic, as opposed to the colonization of the field of the non-economic by the economic. There was part of me that wanted to resist your framing of the current condition as one in which the boundary between the economic and the non-economic has been erased, rather than the economic being accorded pride of place over the non-economic. But then, in reading your coda, I thought of Trump and what you had to to say about the significance of 2016. And what it raises for me is whether, and if so, to what extent, as you think more about this project, you will want to recognize or to consider the differential value of value in the following sense. As you know, I've been obsessing with you and others for a while now about how neoliberalism helps us understand specifically the institution of the American presidency and how we got Obama and then went from Obama to a Trump. And it seems to me that your disaggregation of neoliberalism and financialization opens up a space for thinking about the difference between the Obama and the Trump presidencies as along the lines of differential value. So that the value of the Obama presidency and the kind of political marketing that he mastered as not just strategy for winning office, but for conducting the presidency was, in the words of his first social secretary, that he created the most valuable brand in the world, the Obama brand. But Trump is not about branding. And I mean, in fact, if we look at the spaces which carry the Trump name, the most recent news Trump has gotten is that the people who live in buildings that once had his brand on them are demanding that that brand be removed, right? So Trump's neoliberalism, or what financialization specifically helps us understand about Trump, is the extent to which Trump's practice of politics is not a politics of branding, but a politics of rating. But I'm wondering whether it's the rating that you associate with financialization. Might it not be the case, given that he's playing a character who's playing a president, might it not be that the ratings at which we ought to look are less the ratings that signify in the realm of financialization, and more the ratings that we associate with the media and with mediatization, right? So when Trump talks about ratings, his erasure of the boundary between the economic and the non-economic means that he's constantly moving back and forth, in some ways, not always clearly, and I think it's that ambiguity is productive for him between the financial conception of ratings as speculative accreditation and appreciation, and the mediatized conception of ratings, right? He's constantly talking about his ratings, right? As though he's performing a presidency that is a reality show. And what space is there in your account to think in a triangulated way about the relationship between neoliberalism, financialization, and mediatization in a way that renders an additional level of complexity to this notion of rating by pluralizing it, right? And inviting us to think about the ways in which we're at a moment in which the erasure of the boundary between economic and non-economic has also erased the boundary between rating and ratings, right? Between two different systems of measurement and evaluation and valuation that are an aspect of our, I don't know whether it's still our neoliberal condition or our post-neoliberal condition. I don't know how we would periodize it. Is that helpful at all, or?
Want to take one last, and then we have 5 minutes, or? Yeah, is there any one last question, or? Okay, Michel, then you can answer. Ideal,
Well, I mean, it's complicated and it's partly my fault. It's the trap of financialization in a sense. Because, once again, I'm trying to use the changes that have occurred, it seems to be the transformation that have affected capitalism since as something that sort of precipitates a change of condition. And that change of condition has as one of its characteristics to really corrode or erase a time-honored, I would say, liberal Victorian separation between a public professional realm where everything is about interest and maximizing your interest, and then a domestic but also patriotic, whatever realm, of disinterestedness, where exchange can be disinterested, right? So on the one hand, you have the invisible hand of the market that sort of manages the coordination of interests, and then you have the invisible hand of sexual difference that make women giving and both modest and giving instead of greedy and interested like men, and that beautiful natural complementarity makes for disinterested exchanges in the domestic realm, and the articulation of the two is there. But, okay, so you have the horror story of the Victorian version, but it seems to me that it's also a distinction that is very ingrained in the left, and especially in the left at its moment of depression, where what is economic, what is just purely interested is bad, and so what we have to do is to fight for what is still, immeasurable, disinterested. And I think there's here both a challenge, a chance, and a horror, but also something exciting in the fact that we are, it seems to me, entering into a realm where this distinction is no longer present, which, as Kendall said, it's not an effect of colonization that everything is commodified now. It's just that within the realm of credit that has been partly engineered by financialization, but is by no means reducible to financialization, you have that kind of breakdown. And that's the important thing. The breakdown doesn't mean that ultimately everything is about a measurable rating. The question of whether the rating is measurable or not and how it is measured is an open question, which is, I think what you're saying too by the media ratings and all that. I mean, the little thing that I have in the book, which is like this dystopian vision and version of this sort of credit subjectivity, is this woman, great priestess of the sharing economy and the collaborative economy, called Rachel Botsman. And if you go to her TED Talk of 2012, there's this amazing moment where, she, at the time, she sort of sings the praises of the wonderful collaborative economy with Airbnb and Uber and all that, and it's fantastic, it's all about sharing, as we know. And then she goes to the next step and she says, it's all about reputational capital. It's all about, reputation. And I can see a world coming where we will all have our Facebook hyperpage, where we will have in that same page the ratings coming from our employers, our clients, our lovers, our friends, our photos, and all that will be there, and that will be our portfolio. And then she stops and she says, okay, you will probably say it's a little bit 1984-like. Well, maybe, but nonetheless, and then that's where it gets really interesting. She said, you can say, of course, there are huge privacy issues and they have to be dealt with, and of course. However, think of it in a different way. When you have all your assets exposed like that, you can start managing them. Weeding out the friends, that's down, investing in things that can make you. So that's the dystopian version of it. But my claim, and I'm sorry that it really doesn't work with Gunna's libido, is that it can, I mean, not the hyperpage, but this condition can be turned into something interesting, because to answer very quickly to another point of Bernard, saying that, okay, so financialization happened in the wake of the neoliberal term in the 80s and 90s. It already produced the 2008 crisis. Let's hope that we're not there forever, and so should we already think about the next thing? My wager, my gamble, is that the credit-based condition that we've had coming or burgeoning since the 80s and 90s is not like a big bubble that's going to burst and bring us back in 1978, or that's going to explosively bring us to a completely different realm with a different type of libido, but that it's the beginning of something. And the beginning of something that doesn't necessarily need to be as dystopian as Rachel Botsman has presented. And so it seems to me that this is, you know, in the same way that in the 5th century, at the beginning of an Augustinian condition that sort of prevailed until the 17th, 18th century, and that in the 18th century, at the beginning of a liberal condition with its sort of Victorian partition between the interest and the disinterest that sort of held out for 2 centuries, maybe this is the beginning of another condition, or at least that's what
It's history, right? Okay, well, thank you so much.